Madison's breath came short and fast, her pulse drumming in her ears as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She had said it, and worse, she had been heard. The murmurs in the cabin weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. She could feel the shift, the way the air itself seemed heavier, charged with something she couldn't control anymore. Ava was still watching her, still too calm, still holding that infuriating edge of quiet amusement in her eyes, and that was the final crack in Madison's patience. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, her hand moved. Her fingers closed around Ava's wrist. The moment stretched into something thick and suffocating. The cabin fell silent, every breath, every murmur, every clink of a champagne flute disappearing into the gravity of what had just happened. Ava's body remained completely still, her posture unchanged, her fingers resting lightly on the tray table beside her. But her eyes sharpened, like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. The businessman across the aisle, the one who had been watching with growing interest, set his glass down without a sound. A woman 2 rows ahead, an older woman in pearls and a tailored blazer, turned her head sharply, her lips parting slightly in silent disbelief. A few seats back, the quiet hum of a phone being discreetly lifted to record was barely audible. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, stiffened near the galley, her eyes wide, her grip tightening on the service card, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Madison's breath hitched, her own grip tightening reflexively before she even realized what she had done. She had crossed a line. Ava didn't move, didn't jerk away, didn't react with the outrage that Madison would have preferred, because if she had gasped, if she had snapped back, if she had made this into a scene, then Madison could have justified it, could have redirected the narrative. But Ava didn't give her that. Instead, she slowly turned her head just slightly, her gaze moving from Madison's face down to where her hand was still locked around her wrist. The shift was so subtle, so controlled, and yet it carried more power than if she had shoved her away. Because in that moment, Madison understood exactly what she had done. And worse, so did everyone else. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out. JFK International Airport buzzed with its usual energy, a symphony of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and the hushed conversations of travelers moving through its sleek glass-paneled terminals. The scent of freshly brewed espresso from high-end cafes blended with the crisp, air-conditioned sterility of the departure lounges. Gate A17, reserved for Sky Vista Airlines' exclusive first-class travelers, exuded an air of effortless luxury. Unlike the crowded main gates, where economy passengers juggled overstuffed carry-ons and restless children, this section was an oasis of calm. A few impeccably dressed passengers sat in plush leather chairs, sipping on complimentary champagne while casually scrolling through their phones, the glow of stock market updates reflecting in their sharp, calculating eyes. Flight 499 to London wasn't just any flight. It was a statement. Sky Vista Airlines prided itself on catering to the elite, those who didn't just travel but commanded the skies. This was a route designed for power players, a silent parade of wealth in motion. The boarding process was seamless, more of an invitation than a necessity. A sharply dressed attendant offered warm smiles and soft-spoken greetings as first-class passengers were ushered through priority lanes, their passports barely glanced at before they were guided toward the aircraft. A state-of-the-art Boeing 787 Dreamliner, the very definition of airborne opulence. Inside, the first-class cabin was an entirely different world, separated by frosted glass dividers from the rest of the plane, shielding its passengers from the ordinary. Cream-colored leather seats, wide enough to recline into fully flat beds, stretched in a neat 1-to-1 configuration. Gold-accented reading lamps provided a soft glow, complementing the ambient lighting that adjusted to mimic the natural progression of the day. Each suite came with a 32-inch touchscreen entertainment system, a private minibar stocked with top-shelf liquor, and a flight attendant ready to cater to even the most particular request. A delicate scent of fresh orchids lingered in the air, blending with the faintest hint of aged whiskey and leather. The passengers of Flight 489 were as curated as the menu prepared by a Michelin-starred chef. A hedge fund executive, effortlessly flipping through financial reports on his tablet, barely acknowledged the Dom Perignon poured into his crystal flute. A film director, casually draped in a designer hoodie, nodded at a Hollywood starlet seated 2 rows ahead, both pretending not to notice each other while secretly cataloging each other's presence. A European royal disguised in understated elegance adjusted his silk tie while scanning the menu of in-light delicacies. It was a silent competition of status, where words were unnecessary because everyone in this cabin already knew their worth. Among them sat Ava Sinclair, her presence both commanding and understated. Dressed in an effortlessly chic black ensemble, she exuded the quiet confidence of someone who belonged without needing validation. She carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to spaces where power was both assumed and unspoken. The only accessory hinting at her immense wealth was the custom-made diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist, a limited edition piece so rare that only 3 existed in the world. Her posture was relaxed yet alert, a woman who had mastered the art of watching without being watched. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, Madison Carter strode down the jet bridge with the practiced authority of a woman who had ruled this cabin for over a decade. Her uniform was pristine, her blonde hair neatly pinned into a French twist, her expression a carefully controlled mask of professionalism. To the untrained eye, she was the perfect embodiment of first-class service, polished, efficient, accommodating. But beneath the veneer was a woman who prided herself on control, on knowing exactly who belonged in these seats and who didn't. And when her sharp blue eyes landed on Ava Sinclair, something in her gaze shifted just slightly, just enough, because in her world, power had a look, and this woman didn't fit it. And just like that, a battle that neither of them had spoken into existence had already begun. Ava Sinclair sat with the quiet assurance of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove herself. Every movement was measured, effortless, as if she existed in a space where time bent in her favor. Dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her form just enough to hint at elegance without demanding attention, she was the kind of woman who could walk into any room and own it without uttering a single word. Her presence was a paradox, calm but commanding, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't just her wealth that gave her this power, though she had plenty of it. It was the way she carried herself, the unshakable confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. Born in the heart of Chicago's South Side, Ava had learned early on that the world wasn't designed for women like her to succeed, but she had refused to let circumstance define her. Every closed door had been a challenge, every setback a lesson. She hadn't inherited wealth or privilege. She had built it with sheer intellect, unrelenting drive, and an instinct for business that made even the most seasoned executives take notice. Sky Vista Airlines was her masterpiece, a global aviation empire that had reshaped luxury travel. Yet, despite her staggering success, she had never craved the spotlight. She preferred to move in silence, letting her decisions speak louder than any headline ever could. That was why she traveled alone, without an entourage, without any of the ostentatious displays of wealth that so many billionaires clung to. She enjoyed the anonymity of first class, the illusion that for a few hours she could just be another passenger. She didn't need special treatment, didn't demand recognition. She simply wanted the same courtesy and respect afforded to every other traveler in her position, but experience had taught her that this wasn't always guaranteed. As she adjusted the delicate strap of her watch, a rare, custom-made piece that only a handful of people in the world owned, she felt the weight of a gaze settle on her. Years of navigating boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her had honed her ability to sense scrutiny before it even reached her. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her eyes and met the sharp blue gaze of the flight attendant, standing a few rows ahead. Madison Carter had spent 10 years working first class, and in that time she had developed an unwavering belief that she could read people within seconds of meeting them. She considered herself an expert at knowing who belonged in these seats and who didn't. It wasn't just about wealth She had served athletes, musicians, and new money executives who dripped in designer labels and flaunted their status like a neon sign. No, it was about a certain kind of refinement, an unspoken code that she felt was hers to enforce. She was meticulous, almost obsessively so, in how she ran her section of the plane. Her uniform was always pressed to perfection, her blonde hair twisted into a flawless French knot, not a single strand out of place. Her demeanor was professional, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface, an authority that was not to be questioned. She prided herself on being able to control the cabin, to maintain the exclusivity that first class was supposed to represent. And yet, as her eyes locked onto Ava Sinclair, something in her tightened. It wasn't just the woman's presence that set off an internal alarm. It was the way she sat there, completely at ease, radiating an aura of power that didn't ask for permission. Madison had seen wealth before, had catered to the elite for years, but there was something about this woman that unsettled her. Maybe it was the way she didn't immediately look away. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't flaunting anything, wasn't seeking validation, yet still commanded attention without trying. A flicker of doubt passed through Madison's mind, but she buried it beneath the polished exterior she had perfected over the years. First class had an order, and she was the one who maintained it. She knew these passengers, could predict their behaviors before they even spoke, and something about this woman felt off. She straightened her posture, smoothing down the crisp front of her uniform as she made her way down the aisle, heels clicking against the plush carpet. The moment she reached Ava's seat, she stopped, her voice neutral but firm. "Good evening, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Other passengers barely glanced up, too preoccupied with their own luxuries to care. But Eva knew exactly what this was. She had seen it before. The quiet test, the unspoken challenge. She had been in rooms where men in tailored suits had subtly questioned her authority, where investors had looked at her as if she needed to justify her place at the table. This was no different. Without a word, she reached into her handbag, retrieving the slim leather folder that held her boarding pass. She didn't rush, didn't let the irritation show on her face. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of patience in the face of prejudice. Madison took the pass, glancing down at it, eyes scanning the details. Seat 2C, first class, fully paid ticket, nothing out of place. And yet, she hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, her mind still trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had expected. Ava watched her carefully, noting the pause, the barely perceptible flicker of confusion before Madison masked it. "I assume everything is in order," Ava said, her tone smooth but edged with something colder. Madison forced a tight smile, handing the ticket back. "Of course. Enjoy your flight." As she walked away, a tension lingered in the air, invisible but undeniable. Ava exhaled slowly, returning her gaze to the window. She had a feeling this flight was going to be far longer than expected. Madison's eyes followed Ava from the moment she stepped into first class. Something about the woman unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It wasn't just that she was black. Madison had served wealthy black passengers before. No, it was the way she carried herself. Too composed, too comfortable, too powerful. There was no hesitation in the way she moved, no wide-eyed awe at the luxury surrounding her. She didn't fumble with her seat controls or scan the menu with curiosity like someone experiencing this for the first time. Instead, she settled in with the ease of someone who belonged, or at least someone who believed she did. And that was the problem. Madison had worked in first class long enough to know the type of people who typically occupied these seats. The old money elites who had been flying this route for generations, the tech billionaires who threw down a credit card without a second thought, the international CEOs whose names carried weight in every corner of the business world. These were people whose presence made sense. But this woman, she didn't fit. Not because of her race, not exactly. It was something else, an instinct, a gut feeling that something about her was out of place. The thought gnawed at her as she made her way down the aisle. the hum of quiet conversation and the clinking of glassware filling the cabin. She moved with deliberate confidence, each step calculated, each movement controlled. When she reached C2C, she stopped, tilting her head slightly as she regarded the woman sitting there. "Good evening, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" She delivered the request with her usual air of authority, the kind that made most passengers obey without question. It wasn't uncommon for her to check passes in first class. After all, mistakes happened. Upgrades were issued incorrectly, people wandered into the wrong cabin, and every now and then there was someone who thought they could get away with sneaking into a seat they hadn't paid for. That's what this was. It had to be. Ava's expression remained neutral, but Madison noticed the subtle shift in her eyes, sharp, assessing, as if she were measuring the moment before responding. Without a word, she reached into her handbag and retrieved her boarding pass, holding it out with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who was in complete control of the situation. Madison took it, letting her eyes skim over the details. Ava Sinclair, seat 2C, first class, paid in full. She searched for anything, an error, a misprint, something to justify the suspicion still crawling under her skin. But there was nothing. And yet, she hesitated, her fingers gripping the ticket just a second too long, her mind still trying to make sense of it. Ava noticed. The pause was slight, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what Ava had already suspected the moment Madison had singled her out. This wasn't about airline policy or routine checks. This was about something deeper, something unspoken. It was the same silent judgment she had encountered in boardrooms full of men who had assumed she was the assistant, not the CEO. The same subtle resistance she had felt when negotiating deals with executives who couldn't reconcile her success with their expectation. She had learned long ago how to handle these moments. She didn't challenge Madison. She didn't ask why she was the only passenger being checked. She simply extended her hand, palm up, waiting for her ticket to be returned. "If everything is in order, I'd like my pass back now." Her voice was calm, unshaken, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't asking, she was stating a fact. Madison stiffened. She could feel the weight of the interaction shifting, slipping from her control. For the first time, she became aware of the other passengers watching, not overtly, not enough to draw attention to themselves, but enough that she could feel their eyes. The businessman across the aisle, sipping his champagne with the barest hint of amusement in his gaze. The woman in 3A, pretending to read a magazine, but flipping the same page 3 times. They had noticed. That realization sent a flicker of irritation through her, but she forced a tight smile and handed the ticket back. "Of course," she said, her tone clipped. "Enjoy your flight." She turned on her heel before Ava could respond, walking briskly toward the galley, her heart beating just a little faster than before. She told herself she was imagining it, that this wasn't a thing, that she had simply been doing her job. But as she reached the small crew station at the front of the cabin, she caught Hannah Whitman, the junior flight attendant, giving her a strange look. "What?" Madison asked sharply. Hannah hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "Nothing," she said, but the doubt in her voice was clear. Madison inhaled deeply, forcing herself to push the encounter out of her mind. She had a job to do, a cabin to maintain. Whatever that had been, it was over. Or so she thought. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was just the beginning. Madison handed back the ticket with a tight, insincere smile, her voice laced with something that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't neutral either. "You must have gotten an upgrade." The words slipped out before she even thought about them, but once they did, she didn't regret them. It was a test, one designed to probe, to see if the woman in front of her would take the bait, get flustered, maybe even stammer out some weak explanation for why she was sitting in a seat that, in Madison's mind, wasn't meant for her. Ava didn't blink. She simply tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable except for the ghost of something behind her eyes. Amusement? No. Something sharper. She took the boarding pass back with the same quiet composure she had maintained since the interaction began, tucking it neatly into her bag before adjusting the sleeve of her dress with meticulous precision. She knew exactly what Madison was doing, but she had neither the patience nor the desire to entertain it. There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. A few passengers exchanged glances, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. Some looked away, suddenly engrossed in their in-flight menus or their phones, pretending not to have witnessed what had just transpired. Others weren't so discreet. The businessman across the aisle lowered his glass just slightly, eyes flicking between Madison and Ava with quiet interest. The woman in 3A, the one with the magazine, had stopped pretending to read altogether, though she kept her head down as if hoping no one would notice her noticing. Ava exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. She was tired. Not physically, not even mentally. This wasn't the exhaustion that came from a long flight or a grueling work week. It was the kind of fatigue that settled in your bones, the kind that came from experiencing the same thing over and over again in a different package. Different people, different places, same damn moment. She had seen it in boardrooms, in luxury boutiques, in five-star hotels, where someone had assumed she was lost, or working, or waiting for someone else who actually belonged there. It wasn't always explicit. No one outright told her she didn't belong. They just made her prove that she did. She had perfected the art of choosing when to respond and when to let it slide. This was beneath her. She turned her attention back to the window as if Madison had already ceased to exist. That should have been the end of it. But something about Ava's silence needled at Madison, burrowing under her skin in a way she didn't expect. It was supposed to be simple, a quick check, a small reminder of who ran this cabin, then move on. But instead, she felt something that almost resembled unease. She wasn't used to being ignored, wasn't used to people not engaging. Most passengers, especially those who didn't quite belong, would have at least defended themselves, thrown in a, "well, I paid for this seat," or "I'm actually a frequent flyer," something to justify their presence. Ava hadn't given her that satisfaction, and that irritated her. She turned on her heel, walking back toward the galley, but as she did, she caught Hannah Whitman's gaze again. The younger flight attendant was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between confused and concerned. "What?" Madison snapped. Hannah hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing," she muttered, but it was clear she had seen the interaction. Madison huffed, grabbing a tray of champagne flutes and moving on. If Hannah had an issue, she could report it. She had done nothing wrong. But as she made her way through the cabin, something was still off. She felt it in the way the businessman across the aisle gave her a small, knowing smirk as she passed, in the way the woman with the magazine glanced up just long enough to meet Ava's eyes before looking away again. There was something unspoken here, something hanging in the air, and Madison couldn't stand it. Ava, meanwhile, had already moved on, at least externally. She sipped the glass of water that had been placed on her tray table, her fingers resting lightly against the cool surface. She had no doubt that Madison wouldn't let this go. Some people couldn't help themselves. They felt a need to establish their authority, to make sure you understood that your presence required permission. She had dealt with it for years, learned how to predict the ones who would simply let it go versus the ones who would dig their heels in until they collapsed under the weight of their own ego. She had a feeling Madison was the latter. And she was right. Because 20 minutes later, after the plane had taken off and the seatbelt sign had been turned off, Madison was back. And this time, she wasn't alone. An hour into the flight, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. The soft hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the occasional clink of silverware against fine china as first-class passengers enjoyed their gourmet meals. A few were already reclined, noise-canceling headphones in place, eyes closed as they drifted into the comfort of their private suites. Others scrolled through financial reports or flipped through high-end travel magazines, immersed in their own worlds. Everything about this cabin was designed to be effortless, a seamless experience of exclusivity and ease. But beneath the polished veneer, tension still lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. Ava had spent the last hour pretending she didn't notice the way Madison lingered near the galley, pretending she hadn't caught the flicker of irritation in the flight attendant's sharp blue eyes when she thought no one was looking. She had learned long ago how to let people bury themselves in their own insecurities, how to let their assumptions work against them until they collapsed under their own weight. So she sipped her drink, scrolled through her phone, and waited. And right on cue, Madison was back. This time there was a new energy to her steps, something almost practiced in the way she walked toward Ava's seat. She had taken time to compose herself, to reset the dynamic in her own mind, and now she was going to fix what she saw as a mistake. She stopped just beside Ava's seat, her posture tight but her face carefully neutral. The tone of her voice, however, was dipped in manufactured concern, the type that could almost sound reasonable if you weren't paying attention. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me for a moment," she said, her voice softer than before, but not kind. Ava didn't look up right away. She finished scrolling through a message on her phone before locking the screen and placing it on the tray table beside her. Then, and only then, did she turn her head. Her eyes met Madison's, calm, unbothered. "Is there a problem?" Madison's practiced smile didn't falter. "There's been a seating error. I just need to verify something with you in private." Ava exhaled slowly, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She had been waiting for this. She leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other, deliberately relaxed. "A seating error," she repeated, her tone light, almost amused. Madison didn't flinch. "Yes, it appears this seat might have been assigned incorrectly. If you'll come with me, we can get this sorted out quickly." Ava let the silence stretch between them for just a second too long, enough to make Madison shift slightly, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her uniform. Then Ava tilted her head. "Tell me," she said smoothly, "what exactly makes you think this seat wasn't assigned to me?" Madison hesitated, just briefly, just enough. "It's just a system check, ma'am. I assure you, this is standard procedure." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "Standard procedure?" She gestured slightly around the cabin. "Did you check anyone else's seat?" Another beat of silence. Passengers nearby had started to take notice. The businessman across the aisle, who had been pretending to be engrossed in his tablet, was now watching outright, his glass of champagne suspended just before his lips. The woman with the magazine had stilled completely, her eyes flicking between Ava and Madison, waiting to see how this unfolded. Even the younger flight attendant, Hannah, had stopped mid-step near the galley, her expression tightening. Ava's voice remained calm, but this time it sharpened just enough to cut through the forced pleasantries. "The only error here," she said, voice smooth as glass, "is your assumption that I don't belong." Madison stiffened. Ava saw it immediately, the way her spine locked, the way her jaw tensed just slightly before she schooled her features back into their well-rehearsed mask of authority. She wasn't used to being challenged. A flicker of something dangerous passed through Madison's expression, but she swallowed it down, forcing her voice back into something polite, something controlled. "I'm only following protocol, ma'am." Ava leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only Madison could hear her next words. "No, you're not." Madison's breath hitched, a reaction so quick and so slight that most wouldn't have caught it. But Ava did. The businessman across the aisle let out a low, amused exhale, shaking his head slightly. The woman with the magazine muttered something under her breath, shifting in her seat. And Madison knew. She had lost control of the moment. This wasn't just a routine check anymore. This was something else, something bigger than she had anticipated, and now the entire cabin was watching. Madison's throat tightened. She could feel the scrutiny now, feel the eyes on her, the quiet tension hanging thick in the air. She had two choices. She could back down, or she could double down. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She made the wrong choice. Madison took a slow breath, her eyes flicking around the cabin before she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Listen, I don't make the rules," she murmured, her tone carrying the forced patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "But first class is exclusive." The words weren't just a statement. They were a message, a warning, a confirmation of everything Ava already knew was happening here. Ava felt her muscles tighten, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give Madison the satisfaction of a reaction. She had spent years perfecting the art of holding her ground without showing the weight of the moment pressing against her. She had been in too many rooms with too many people like this. People who didn't say what they meant outright, but made sure you felt it anyway. It was always the same, some version of, "You don't belong, you're out of place, this space wasn't made for you." She let the silence hang for a moment, long enough that Madison shifted slightly, as if expecting a protest, some frustrated defense that would justify whatever she had planned next. But Ava didn't give her one. Instead, she inhaled slowly, exhaling just as softly, before tilting her head just enough to meet Madison's eyes, her own expression unreadable. And that one word landed like a slap. Madison blinked, thrown off by the response. Ava wasn't outraged. She wasn't even arguing. She had expected pushback, maybe even an attempt at proving herself, but this was something else. And worse, other passengers had heard it. The woman with the magazine at 3A, who had been quietly observing from the beginning, let out a soft, incredulous "wow." It wasn't loud, wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it carried enough weight to make the statement land. The businessman across the aisle set down his champagne glass, his brow lifting slightly as he watched Madison carefully now, his expression unreadable but unmistakably engaged. Even Hannah, the younger flight attendant, had frozen near the galley, her fingers gripping the edge of the service cart a little too tightly. Madison felt the shift immediately. This was no longer just between her and Ava. This was something bigger now, something she couldn't take back. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into her expression. Ava could see it, could feel it, and she could have let the moment stretch, let Madison sit in her own mistake, let her flounder under the weight of the realization that she had said the quiet part out loud. But instead she did something worse. She smiled. Not big, not dramatic, just the smallest, faintest curve of her lips, something almost imperceptible but devastating in its quiet power. And in that moment Madison knew she had just lost something she couldn't get back. Madison's breath came short and fast, her pulse drumming in her ears as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She had said it, and worse, she had been heard. The murmurs in the cabin weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. She could feel the shift, the way the air itself seemed heavier, charged with something she couldn't control anymore. Ava was still watching her, still too calm, still holding that infuriating edge of quiet amusement in her eye, and that was the final crack in Madison's patience. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, her hand moved. Her fingers closed around Ava's wrist. The moment stretched into something thick and suffocating. The cabin fell silent, every breath, every murmur, every clink of a champagne flute disappearing into the gravity of what had just happened. Ava's body remained completely still, her posture unchanged, her fingers resting lightly on the tray table beside her. But her eyes sharpened like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. The businessman across the aisle, the one who had been watching with growing interest, set his glass down without a sound. A woman 2 rows ahead, an older woman in pearls and a tailored blazer, turned her head sharply, her lips parting slightly in silent disbelief. A few seats back, the quiet hum of a phone being discreetly lifted to record was barely audible. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, stiffened near the galley, her eyes wide, her grip tightening on the service cart as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Madison's breath hitched, her own grip tightening reflexively before she even realized what she had done. She had crossed a line. Ava didn't move, didn't jerk away, didn't react with the outrage that Madison would have preferred. Because if she had gasped, if she had snapped back, if she had made this into a scene, then Madison could have justified it, could have redirected the narrative. But Ava didn't give her that. Instead, she slowly turned her head just slightly, her gaze moving from Madison's face down to where her hand was still locked around her wrist. The shift was so subtle, so controlled, and yet it carried more power than if she had shoved her away. Because in that moment, Madison understood exactly what she had done. And worse, so did everyone else. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't pull away, didn't recoil, didn't even shift in her seat. She simply lowered her gaze to where Madison's hand gripped her wrist, studying it like an insignificant inconvenience, like a smudge on a glass of fine wine. The moment stretched, silent and suffocating, thick with the weight of every watching eye in the cabin. Madison's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, her fingers tightening just slightly before she realized she had already held on for too long. Ava exhaled softly, not a sigh, not even annoyance, just a slow release of air, controlled, deliberate, as if she were waiting for something to happen, and then, without urgency, she reached for her phone with her free hand. Madison's stomach dropped. The movement was too calm, too precise, and somehow that was worse than if Ava had reacted in anger. Madison should have let go immediately, but she hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to betray the flicker of panic creeping up her spine. Yvonne's manicured fingers tapped her phone screen, her expression unreadable as she lifted it to her ear. The softest murmur of a ringing line filled the cabin, and for the first time, Madison felt cold. Ava still hadn't looked at her, still hadn't acknowledged the mess Madison had just tangled herself in. The businessman across the aisle watched with sharp interest, his hands now folded, his glass of champagne forgotten. The woman in 3A who had muttered "wow" earlier wasn't even pretending to be subtle anymore. People were invested now. They were waiting. And then, finally, Ava spoke. "Gate control, this is Ava Sinclair," she said, her voice as smooth as ever but now carrying a weight that made the temperature in the cabin seem to drop. "There's been an incident on Flight 489. Madison's throat went dry. Ava leaned back slightly, her free hand finally lifting, her fingers gently prying Madison's grip from her wrist, like she was brushing off a leaf that had landed on her sleeve. Not forceful, not aggressive, just dismissive. That simple gesture sent a ripple of understanding through Madison's entire body. She had just grabbed the CEO of Sky Vista Airlines, and now she was about to learn exactly what that meant. Madison's world stopped. The words came softly, spoken with the same effortless grace Ava had maintained throughout the entire exchange, but the impact hit like a freight train. The moment the words left her lips, "Hello, this is Ava Sinclair, CEO of Sky Vista Airlines. We have a situation on Flight 489. The entire energy in the cabin shifted. Madison froze, her body locking up so tightly it felt like her muscles had turned to stone. The color drained from her face, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs, and for the first time in her 10 years of flying first class, she felt weightless in the worst possible way, like she had just stepped off a ledge she hadn't realized was there. The businessman across the aisle exhaled sharply, his brows lifting as he turned his full attention to Ava. The woman in 3A let out a stunned, "Oh my God," under her breath, shifting in her seat, fully invested now. Others, who had been pretending not to listen, stopped pretending. Eyes snapped to Ava, then to Madison, then back to Ava. The realization rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. The CEO, the owner, the woman Madison had just laid hands on, controlled the entire airline. Madison's ears buzzed, the sound of blood rushing through her veins so loud that, for a moment, she barely registered Ava's next words. "Yes, I'll remain seated," Ava said, her voice still composed, still terrifyingly steady, "but upon landing, I expect an immediate meeting with the flight supervisor and corporate HR." A pause. Then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she added, "And I want her," her gaze flicked to Madison still holding the phone to her ear, "escorted off the plane upon arrival." Madison's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't happening. This was some kind of mistake. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ava finally lowered the phone from her ear, letting the silence drag out, stretching the tension until it felt unbearable. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to gloat. She had already won without lifting a finger. Madison's pulse hammered so violently she felt lightheaded. She looked around frantically, searching for support, for someone, anyone, to interject, to undo what had just happened. But there was nothing but stares. Passengers weren't just watching. They were waiting. waiting to see what she would do, waiting to see her fall. The plane touched down at Heathrow with a smooth, controlled glide, but to Madison, it felt like a crash landing. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick, but she couldn't move, could barely breathe. Every second of taxiing felt like a countdown to something she couldn't escape. The soft chime of the intercom signaled the captain's announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." His voice was calm, professional, oblivious to the fact that Madison's entire world had just collapsed. She barely heard it, because standing just outside the aircraft door, visible through the narrow gap between the curtains of first class, were two uniformed security officers. Waiting. Ava hadn't looked at her once since making that phone call, but she hadn't needed to. Her silence was worse than any confrontation. Madison had spent the last 20 minutes frozen in place, hands clenched in her lap, brain cycling through a desperate loop of thoughts. How do I fix this? How do I make this go away? But there was no fixing this. Not now. Not ever. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a cold spike of dread through her spine. The curtain separating first class from the front galley parted, and in stepped James Calloway, Senior Director of Sky Vista Airlines Operations. Tall, graying at the temples, his suit sharp, his expression void of sympathy. The second Madison saw him, she knew. This was over. He stopped just beside her seat, exhaling through his nose as if the very act of dealing with her was already a waste of his time. Then, in a voice so flat and unyielding it sounded like a death sentence, he said 4 words that ended her career in real time. "You're done. Pack up." The weight of those words slammed into her chest, knocking the breath from her lungs. Passengers were silent, listening but pretending not to, watching without looking. Madison's mouth opened. No, this can't be happening. "Mr. Calloway," she started, her voice barely holding together. This is all just a misunderstanding. I was only trying to enforce protocol. He didn't react. Didn't nod, didn't blink. Didn't offer a single indication that he even heard her. "You're being relieved of duty, effective immediately," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken at all. "Escort is waiting outside the aircraft. Upon arrival at the terminal, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending a formal review. HR will send further instructions to your email within the hour." Madison's blood turned to ice. Her breath stuttered. "Wait, please, I didn't mean—" "Stand up," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. She didn't move. Her mind was screaming at her to find a way out, to fix this, to turn this around, but there was nothing left to say. She had been judging passengers for years, and now the entire plane was judging her. Madison's legs felt like lead as she finally, slowly rose from her seat. Every motion was stiff, robotic, as if her body refused to cooperate with what was happening. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her breath shallow. Her uniform, once a symbol of her control, now felt like a costume on a woman who no longer existed. James Calloway didn't offer her a second glance. He had already moved on. The security officers at the aircraft door waited with the patience of men who had done this before. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to remove her. The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating now, thick with the unspoken knowledge that something irreversible had happened. No one needed an announcement. No one needed to be told what was going on. They all knew, and Madison could feel it. She reached down for her crew bag, fingers fumbling with the handle. She wanted to disappear, to rewind the past few hours, to take back every assumption, every decision, every word that had led to this moment. But there was no undoing it. There was only what came next. And what came next was humiliation. She took a step forward, and the moment she did, every single pair of eyes in first class followed her. The businessman across the aisle lifted his champagne glass in a quiet, mocking toast. The woman in 3A, the one who had muttered "wow" earlier, now sat with her arms crossed, her gaze unapologetically locked on Madison, her expression somewhere between satisfaction and quiet vindication. 2 rows back, a younger man in a tailored suit held his phone at just the right angle, not obvious, but definitely recording. Madison's entire body burned. She wanted to scream at them, wanted to lash out, to demand that they look away, to tell them that this wasn't fair, that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But none of them would have cared, because they had seen it. They had seen her test Ava. They had seen her push Ava. They had seen her grab Ava. And they had seen Ava do something much, much worse. Ava had destroyed her without ever raising her voice. Madison's breath hitched as she forced herself forward, past the rows of luxury, past the people who had once barely acknowledged her presence but were now watching her with open curiosity. The security officers didn't touch her. They didn't need to. She wasn't resisting. There was nothing left to fight for. She reached the front of the cabin, and for the first time since this had begun, Ava moved. She stood, slowly, the same calculated grace in every movement. Madison stopped breathing. She didn't know why she had expected Ava to just let her go, to let her vanish without another word, but she should have known that wasn't how this ended. Ava turned, meeting Madison's eyes for the first time since she had made that call, and Madison felt her entire body lock up. Ava smiled, not mocking, not cruel, just a quiet, almost polite smile, one that said, "I didn't do this to you, you did." Then, in a voice as smooth as silk, she spoke. "I want you to remember this moment," she said, soft enough that only Madison and the nearest passengers could hear, yet heavy enough to crush the air between them. Madison's throat tightened. Ava's gaze didn't waver. "Not because of what's happening to you," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "but because of what you did to yourself." The words landed like a final nail in a coffin. A slow, suffocating silence stretched through the cabin. Then Ava turned away, as if Madison had already stopped existing. And Madison knew with bone-deep certainty that she had. Ava took her time as she exited the aircraft, moving with the same effortless grace that had unsettled Madison from the very beginning. The weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air, pressing down on Madison's chest like a crushing force she couldn't escape. Every step Ava took was deliberate, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. As if this moment belonged to her. And it did. Madison stood motionless, her pulse roaring in her ears, her throat so tight she could barely breathe. She wanted to move, to speak, to do something, but she couldn't. She could only watch as Ava, the woman she had tried to diminish, walked away untouched, unbothered, and completely in control. And then Ava stopped. Just before stepping through the jet bridge, she turned, locking eyes with Madison one last time. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the oxygen thinning, as if the very structure of the plane itself was working against Madison now. She felt exposed, standing there like a child who had been caught, like a criminal awaiting sentencing. Ava's expression remained unreadable, her gaze sharp yet devoid of anger. She didn't need anger. She had already won. Then, in a voice as smooth as glass, she spoke. "You didn't lose your job because of me." Her words were calm, effortless, but razor-sharp. Madison's breath hitched. Ava let the silence drag, stretching the moment until it was unbearable. Then, with the finality of a judge handing down a verdict, she said, "You lost it because of you." The words hit harder than anything Madison had ever felt in her life, because deep down, she knew they were true. Her knees felt weak, her entire body numb as the weight of everything came crashing down at once. Passengers still watched, some openly, others pretending not to, but they all knew what they had just witnessed. Madison's entire career had just ended in real time, and Ava had never even raised her voice. Madison stood there, frozen in place, the cabin eerily silent except for the low hum of the engines powering down. Every inch of her body felt wrong, like she had been dropped into a nightmare where she could see everything falling apart, but couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Her mouth was dry, her fingers twitched at her sides, but she couldn't move. She couldn't escape the fact that this was happening. Ava hadn't screamed, she hadn't fought, she hadn't needed to. That was the part that stung the most, that burned like acid in Madison's chest. If Ava had yelled, if she had caused a scene, if she had given Madison something, anything to push back against, maybe this wouldn't feel so devastating. But no, Ava had dismantled her with calm, effortless precision, with nothing more than her words, her presence, and the unbearable weight of being right. Madison had spent years believing she had control. In this cabin, she set the rules. She determined who deserved respect, who belonged, and who needed to be reminded of their place. And yet, in a matter of minutes, the illusion had shattered, because the truth was standing right in front of her. She hadn't lost to rage or defiance or outrage. She had lost to silence. Ava had simply existed, and that alone had been enough to undo her. Madison's breath came short and sharp as she finally forced herself to look away, to break the unbearable eye contact. Her gaze flickered to the passengers still seated around her, watching, waiting, absorbing every second of her humiliation. Some of them had expressions carefully blank, pretending to be neutral, but Madison could see it. The businessman across the aisle had a slight smirk, as if this was the best in-flight entertainment he had ever witnessed. The woman in 3A was shaking her head, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, knowing line. Further back, a younger man was still recording, not even bothering to hide it anymore. Madison wanted to run, to disappear before the moment could stretch any longer, before the whispers and smirks turned into stories that would outlive her career. She had spent years thinking power was about control, about enforcing authority, about reminding people where they stood. But real power, the kind Ava wielded, it didn't have to scream, it didn't have to fight. It moved quietly until it spoke, and by the time it did, it was already too late. Madison had always thought of racism as something obvious, something loud and undeniable, something that happened in viral videos where people yelled slurs or got dragged out of stores. She never saw herself as part of that. But here she was, standing in the wreckage of her own actions, realizing too late that racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet assumption, a glance that lingers too long, a request that wouldn't have been made of anyone else, a whisper, a hesitation, a test disguised as procedure. It's in the way someone asks for proof from one person but not another, in the way a smile is just a little tighter, a tone a little sharper. It's subtle, designed to be deniable, to seem like nothing at all, but when exposed, when the world sees it for what it is, it has consequences. Ava had understood this long before Madison did. That was why she hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had let Madison fall into the trap of her own assumptions, let her build the rope that eventually strangled her career. Because in the end, it wasn't Ava who destroyed her, it was Madison herself. Every decision she had made, every word, every gesture, it had all led to this moment. And the worst part, no one had stopped her. Not when she questioned Ava's seat, not when she pushed further, not when she grabbed her wrist. They had only watched, until it was too late. So now the question is for you. If you had been on that flight, would you have spoken up? Would you have said something when Madison kept pressing Ava for her ticket? Would you have stepped in when she claimed there was a seating error? Or would you have sat there, silent, waiting for someone else to fix it? Would you have been one of the passengers exchanging glances but saying nothing? Would you have watched, but only reacted once it was clear Ava had already won? And do you think Madison got what she deserved? Do you think losing her job, her career, her reputation was too much? Or was it exactly what she had coming? After all, she had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't, and in the end, the one person she tried to push out turned out to be the one person who had the power to push her out instead. Tell me what you think in the comments. Would you have spoken up? Would you have acted differently? Or do you think Madison's fate was sealed the moment she made her first assumption? Let's talk about it, and if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and unfiltered, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the smallest moments hold the biggest lessons.